Here are the 6 biggest mistakes that most people make when it comes to benefics and malefics in astrology. The first and biggest of the mistakes is to think that benefic and malefic is the same thing as good and bad. Now, this mistake is very old. As you can see from just looking at this terminology itself in the Latin, male means bad and bene means good. This misconception is a mutation of the original concept, which was that various planets communicated information from various gods. And some of those gods represented things that were basically pleasant, while other gods represented things that were sort of unpleasant. But pleasant and unpleasant is not really the same as good and bad, and that's very important to recognize. Now, thankfully for us, the original concept of this dichotomy between planets survives in the Sanskrit terminology, Krura and Somya, which instead of meaning malefic, benefic, good and bad, means hard and soft, or you can say rough and gentle, or unpleasant and pleasant. So the so-called malefic planets are described as hard, Krura, because they're tough, they're strong, and they're unforgiving. The so-called benefic planets are described as Somya, or soft, because they're sympathetic and they're gentle and they're forgiving. Now let me explain why seeing planets as hard and soft is really not at all the same thing as seeing them as benefic or malefic or good and bad. Hard qualities like strength and toughness can be good, even great in certain circumstances. And they can be bad or even awful in others. So, specifically, hard qualities are great when you're dealing with the attacks of enemies and rivals, and they're awful when you're dealing with the delicate affections of family and friends. And on the other hand, the soft qualities like generosity and sympathy, those are great when you're dealing with the delicate affections of friends and family, but they can be really awful when you're dealing with the attacks of rivals and enemies. So in conclusion, the Latin terms benefic and malefic, they reinforce a serious misconception, which is that some planets are good and other planets are bad. This is a misconception because the actual fact is that any planet can be good and any planet can be bad, depending on the situation. Benefic planets represent pleasant qualities like generosity and forgiveness and optimism. But those pleasant qualities in the wrong settings produce problems like gullibility or low anxiety tolerance. Similarly, malefic planets represent hard and unpleasant qualities like harshness and relentlessness. But those very qualities in the right setting become assets like pragmatism and courage and strength. So let's try to transition our terminology away from benefic and malefic and towards something like soft and hard or unpleasant and pleasant. The second big mistake about benefics and malefics is that all of the planets have to fit into one of these two categories. So when you try to categorize the planets, it's kind of easy and obvious to see that Mars and Saturn are clearly strict, tough, unforgiving, and they clearly fit in this description, malefic or hard. And similarly, it's pretty easy to see that Venus and Jupiter really match the qualities of the soft, pleasant, benefic. But where do these other 4 guys fit in? Well, you can try to figure that out and sort that out, but actually, what I want to tell you right now is that's a mistake. They don't fit into one of those 2 categories. The third big mistake about benefics and malefics is that the sun is malefic. So the sun might seem malefic, but if you see it that way, you're going to be prone to some serious misconceptions about what the sun symbolizes and or what malefics are all about. So the sun, it's strict and it's strong like a malefic, but it also symbolizes several benefic qualities like patience, morality, and maturity. So the sun has qualities of malefics and it has qualities of benefics, and that's why it doesn't fit in either basket. Some suggest that the sun is more malefic the closer it is to winter, but it's more accurate, really, to say that the sun is just colder the closer it is to the winter solstice. Colder or weaker, it's out for less time. And conversely, it's hotter or stronger the closer it is to the summer solstice. So it doesn't really make the sun malefic or benefic, its proximity to the solstice. It makes it hotter or colder or weaker or stronger. The weaker the sun, the more covert or indirectly we interpret its symbolism. And the stronger the sun, the more directly and overt. So in conclusion, forcing the sun into the malefic basket only obscures its true character, which is that it's a mixture of both. The fourth big mistake is that Mercury is benefic. Well, Mercury might seem benefic, but if you see it that way, it's going to lead to misconceptions about what Mercury represents and or what benefics are like. So specifically, Mercury is friendly, so it feels benefic. But Mercury's friendliness is entirely different from the friendliness of a benefic. Benefic friendliness results from the fundamental benefic quality of being generous and optimistic and forgiving. Mercury does not have those qualities. It has friendliness, but not from that stuff. Mercury's friendliness results from its impartiality, its openness, and its curiosity. This is very, very important to realize, otherwise you really mess up the fundamentals of what Mercury really is at its core. Mercury lacks the positive prejudice of a benefic. In fact, it lacks every single prejudice. Its fundamental characteristic is to be without all prejudice and to be completely neutral. Now, some suggest that Mercury is malefic when it's influenced by a malefic and it's benefic when it's influenced by a benefic. So that's not really wrong, but it's a little bit messy and it still tends to obscure Mercury's true neutral nature. So it would be better to say that when Mercury is influenced by a malefic, you get hard qualities in the intellect. The intellect is more pragmatic. It's more rational and logical, and it tends to demand proof. And on the other hand, when Mercury is influenced by a benefic, it's not that it becomes benefic, but rather it gets soft qualities or gentle qualities in the intellect. So that presents itself as optimism in the evaluation of ideas and proposal, and also gives fanciful or fruitful creativity in thinking and problem solving. So in conclusion, forcing Mercury into either basket obscures its most important quality, which is neutrality. The fifth big mistake about benefics and malefics is that the moon is something. Well, when we come to the moon, we really see the most vivid illustration of how this benefic malefic paradigm breaks down when you try to force it upon every single planet. It's most obvious with the moon because it's practically impossible to put the moon squarely in either category. Some people will say it's the lord of the night, so it must be malefic, it's deceptive, and so forth. Others will say it's the mother, so it's got to be benefic, it's loving and emotional, and so forth. The truth of the matter is, just like the sun, but even more vividly, the moon has a mixture of benefic and malefic qualities, and therefore shouldn't be pigeonholed into either group. Some suggest that the moon becomes more benefic the brighter it is. But I believe it would be better to just interpret the waxing and waning of the moon in its own right. So how would you do that? Well, the darker, the more hidden the moon is in the sky, then the more covertly we frame its symbolism. While the brighter or more visible the moon is in the sky, the more overtly we frame the symbolisms. What do I mean by covert framing for symbolism? Covert interpretive frame casts the moon's symbolisms into subliminal and mysterious settings. Subliminal and mysterious is not inherently good or bad or benefic and malefic. It's just covert, which just means it's not obvious. So take the moon's basic symbolism of emotions, for example. A dark moon means covert emotions. There's good and bad things about it being covertly emotional. For example, if you're covertly emotional, then you don't really express yourself very well. But your actions really get motivated by the emotions which are sitting covertly within you. And those covert emotions don't really get in the way of your performance and your rational behavior. Now, let's just flip it around for an overt or a bright moon. This overt interpretive frame would mean that you have, let's say, overt emotions, which again is neither benefic nor malefic. It's not good or bad. It has good and bad aspects. So what's a good thing about overt emotions? People can relate to them. People can see them. You can express them. You can feel understood. But what's a bad thing about overt emotions? You often reveal too much. You often can't keep anything private that should be private. And you often have your emotional qualities interfere with your rational processes and bog down your actions. So what we see really is that even the waxing and waning of the moon doesn't correspond to beneficence and maleficence. So to consider the moon either a benefic or a malefic really just obscures the fact that it's always a mixture of both, with its own unique soft twist on both types. The sixth and last big mistake when it comes to benefics and malefics is to say that the lunar nodes are malefic. So the lunar nodes, which are known as Rahu and Ketu in Sanskrit, are usually cast into this malefic basket. And it's mostly because malefics are skeptical and pragmatic, and the nodes seem to fit that description, at least the skeptical part. But the thing about the nodes that's quite different from malefics is their extremity. The lunar nodes have skepticism to the extreme point of blasphemous heterodoxy. That's what the nodes represent. And therefore, because of those blasphemous heterodoxy, they're associated with destabilization and revolution. So excessiveness is the key quality of the nodes and is not an inherent quality of malefics. In fact, malefics have the opposite quality. Malefics are minimalists. They're cold. They're Spartan. They're not excessive. Excessiveness is really a benefic quality gone wrong. It's just generosity and luxury, too much of it. And there's another way that the nodes defy being categorized as a malefic. Malefics tend to be realistic and pragmatic. The nodes, although skeptical, are not realistic and pragmatic. They're extremely fantastic or fantasy-oriented, and they're very, very, very idealistic. So in conclusion, the nodes also are definitely not benefic, and they're also certainly not malefic. They are something unique. The final conclusion here, we have two. Firstly, the malefic-benefic binary is a real thing in astrology, but it's misunderstood as good and bad binary. The truth of the matter is that all planets, any planet, can be either good or bad. And that depends entirely upon the circumstances that the planet finds itself in. Even when a malefic is good, it still has malefic, in other words, hard, tough qualities to it. So good malefics give things like strength, toughness, resilience, tenacity. And benefics, when they're bad, they still have a benefic quality to them. And not good quality, but they have a softness to them. So they're going to give wimpiness, softness, suckeriness, over luxuriousness, over indulgence. The second conclusion that we want to make is that this binary of a hard and soft, or malefic and benefic, really only applies to 4 planets. Saturn and Mars are really hard or malefic, and Venus and Jupiter are really soft or benefic. And the other guys, just leave them out of this, because if you force them into either category, you only wind up misunderstanding both the planet and the category. Thank you for watching, all the likes, the subscribes, the comments, etc. Please head over to my website and check out the content there, including the readings and reports that I offer. The link to my site is on the screen and also in the description below. Thank you.